What if you vanished from your own life, leaving behind nothing but silence and a handful of lies that weren't even yours? On June 30th, 2005, in the quiet market town of Richmond, North Yorkshire, 19-year-old Jenny Nicholl kissed her mother goodbye, walked out her front door with camping gear slung over her shoulder, and disappeared into thin air. No body, no crime scene, no evidence of where she went or what happened to her, just an abandoned car and a series of text messages that would eventually expose one of the most calculated deceptions in British criminal history. For nearly 3 years, investigators hit one dead end after another. Jenny's family endured birthdays, Christmases, and anniversaries without answers, without closure, without even remains to bury. The man responsible continued living his life, convinced that without a body he could never be convicted. He was wrong. This is the story of a secret relationship that turned deadly, of fake text messages that betrayed their author, and of groundbreaking forensic linguistics that helped secure one of Britain's landmark no-body murder convictions. This is the cold case that proved words can speak louder than physical evidence, leading to an arrest that shocked the entire community of Richmond and changed British law forever. Let me introduce you to Jenny Nicholl. Born on October 6, 1985, in County Antrim, Northern Ireland, Jenny was the kind of young woman who lit up every room she entered. At 19 years old, she stood just 5 feet 3 inches tall, but her presence was anything but small. Those who knew her describe a vivacious, adventurous spirit with an infectious love for life. Jenny was passionate about music. She played guitar and performed regularly with local pub bands across Richmond and the surrounding North Yorkshire countryside. Picture her on stage, fingers moving across guitar strings, lost in the melody, connecting with an audience through the universal language of sound. Music wasn't just a hobby for Jenny. It was her escape, her expression, her way of making sense of the world around her. But Jenny's love for the outdoors rivaled even her musical passion. She was an avid camper who felt most at home under the open sky, surrounded by the rolling moors and ancient woodlands of North Yorkshire. She knew every trail, every hidden spot, every secluded camping area around Richmond. Her weekends were often spent exploring Sandbeck Plantation or other local woodland areas, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. Her parents, Brian and Ann Nicholl, trusted their daughter's independence. They had raised her to be self-sufficient, capable, and confident. The Nicholl family had deep roots in the military. Brian served in the British Army, and when their eldest son also joined and was posted to nearby Catterick Garrison, the family settled permanently in Richmond. They lived on Bolton Avenue in a close-knit household where communication was constant and affection was freely given. Jenny worked at the local supermarket, saving money while figuring out her future. She dreamed of continuing her music, perhaps professionally. She talked about traveling, about seeing more of the world beyond the Yorkshire Dales. Friends described Jenny as loyal, trustworthy, and always in touch. She wasn't the type to go silent. If she was going to be away, she'd let people know. If plans changed, she'd call. This pattern of constant communication would become critically important later, because when Jenny went quiet, everyone who knew her recognized immediately that something was terribly wrong. But there was something else about Jenny Nicholl that her family didn't know. Something hidden. Something dangerous. For years, since she was just 14 years old, Jenny had been groomed by a man more than twice her age. A married father of 2 named David Hodgson, a local DJ who used his position, his charm, and his manipulation to draw a vulnerable teenager into a secret relationship that would ultimately cost Jenny her life. On the evening of June 30th, 2005, Jenny told her parents she was going camping with friends. She packed her gear, including items she typically brought on outdoor adventures, a cassette player, a teddy bear she'd had since childhood, her nightdress, and other personal belongings. At 6 o'clock in the evening, she kissed her mother Ann goodbye and climbed into her white Rover 214i. Anne watched her daughter drive away into the warm summer evening. It was an ordinary departure that marked the beginning of an extraordinary nightmare. It was the last time anyone from Jenny's family would ever see her alive. The first indication that something had gone wrong came not immediately, but in the form of an absence that grew louder with each passing hour. When Jenny didn't return home the next day, her parents weren't immediately alarmed. She had told them she'd be camping after all. But when the second day passed with no word, no text, no call, Anne and Brian began to worry. By July 4th, 4 days after Jenny left home, that worry had transformed into full-blown panic. The Nicholls reported their daughter missing to North Yorkshire police. Officers began by checking the places Jenny was known to frequent. They visited her favorite camping spots in the countryside around Richmond. They spoke to her friends, her co-workers at the supermarket, members of the band she played with. Everyone said the same thing: this wasn't like Jenny. She wouldn't just vanish without telling me one. Then came the discovery that turned the missing persons inquiry into something far more sinister. Jenny's white Rover was found abandoned in the car park of the Holly Hill pub in Richmond, The car was locked. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of forced entry. But Jenny was nowhere to be found. Her camping gear, which she'd taken with her when she left home, was also missing. It was as if she had parked the car, walked away, and simply ceased to exist. Investigators began piecing together Jenny's movements on June 30th. She had been seen in Richmond that day, but after early evening, the sightings stopped. No one could definitively place her anywhere after she drove away from Bolton Avenue. The most baffling detail was this: Jenny had left home willingly, with items suggesting she planned to camp overnight. She had told her parents a believable story. There was no evidence of abduction from the house. Everything suggested she had gone to meet someone she knew, someone she trusted. But who? The investigation took a significant turn on July 9th, just 9 days after Jenny disappeared. That's when North Yorkshire police interviewed a 45-year-old, unemployed man from Richmond named David Hodgson. Hodgson lived on Olav Road with his wife and 2 daughters. He was known in the community as a local DJ who worked occasional gigs at pubs and community events. His daughters had attended the same school as Jenny, St. Francis Xavier School in Richmond. During that first interview, Hodgson denied any involvement in Jenny's disappearance. In fact, he initially denied even knowing her well. But investigators had information that contradicted his claims. They had learned from Jenny's friends that she had been involved in some kind of relationship with an older man, though she had kept the details secret. As detectives pressed Hodgson, his story began to shift. Eventually, he admitted that yes, he and Jenny had known each other. Yes, they had been close. But he insisted their friendship was innocent and that any sexual relationship had only begun after Jenny turned 16, the legal age of consent in England. He claimed they had been intimate only 5 times, and that their affair had ended a full year before her disappearance. Hodgson seemed nervous during the interview, but he maintained his innocence. He had an alibi for the night of June 30th, or so he claimed. He said he'd been with a woman that evening, someone who could verify his whereabouts. Police made a note to follow up on that claim. For now, David Hodgson was a person of interest, but nothing more. They had no physical evidence linking him to Jenny's disappearance. No witnesses who saw them together that night. No body, no crime scene. And then, something extraordinary happened. The day after police interviewed David Hodgson, Jenny's mobile phone suddenly came back to life. On July 10th, text messages began arriving from Jenny's phone to her family and friends. The messages said she was fine. She was camping in Scotland. She needed time alone to think. She asked not to be contacted. She said she'd be in touch when she was ready. For Jenny's family, these messages were a lifeline of hope. Jenny Nicholl immediately traveled to the locations indicated by the cell tower data, first to Carlisle in Cumbria, near the Scottish border, then to Jedburgh in the Scottish borders. She searched frantically, asking locals if they'd seen her daughter, checking campsites and hostels. But Jenny was nowhere to be found. It was as if she was a ghost, sending messages from the ether but never materializing in physical form. Police, however, were immediately suspicious. The timing was too coincidental. The messages had started flowing right after David Hodgson was interviewed, and there was something else. Something subtle but significant about the language in those texts. They didn't quite sound like Jenny. The phrasing was off. The style was different. But how could police prove it? How could they demonstrate that someone else had written those messages? That question would become the key to unlocking the entire case. But first, investigators needed to find physical evidence, anything that could link David Hodgson directly to Jenny's disappearance. And they had a strong hunch about where to look. Detective Chief Inspector Pete Martinet, his team at North Yorkshire Police faced a daunting challenge. They had a missing woman, a suspicious older man with a history of inappropriate contact with that woman, and text messages that might or might not be genuine. What they didn't have was a body, a crime scene, or any direct evidence of foul play. The investigation intensified. Throughout the summer of 2005, officers conducted extensive searches across more than 150 locations in the North Yorkshire countryside. They enlisted the help of soldiers from nearby Catterick Garrison, who combed through moorland and woodland with military precision. They searched septic tanks at farms, abandoned buildings, and every known camping spot Jenny frequented. Specialist search dogs were brought in. Helicopters with thermal imaging equipment scanned vast areas from above. But despite these massive efforts, Jenny Nicholl remained missing. Meanwhile, investigators were building a detailed picture of David Hodgson's relationship with Jenny. What emerged was deeply disturbing. Hodgson had begun grooming Jenny when she was just 14 years old. At that time, his own daughters were attending school with her. Hodgson had positioned himself as a mentor figure, someone Jenny could talk to, someone who understood her love of music. But that relationship had turned sexual when Jenny was still legally a child. The true nature of the relationship came to light through interviews with Jenny's friends. They revealed that Jenny had been trapped in a toxic cycle with Hodgson for years. She had tried to end things multiple times. But Hodgson was possessive and manipulative. He couldn't bear the thought of losing control over her. And in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Jenny had started seeing someone else, Hodgson's own elder brother Robert. This revelation opened up an entirely new angle for investigators. They now had a clear motive. David Hodgson wasn't just angry about losing Jenny. He was humiliated by the fact that she had turned to his own brother. In a small town like Richmond, where everyone knows everyone, this kind of betrayal would have been unbearable for a man like Hodgson, a man consumed by jealousy and the need for control. Robert Hodgson was interviewed extensively. He confirmed that he and Jenny had been seeing each other romantically in the weeks before her disappearance. He claimed he had no idea about his younger brother's history with Jenny, though investigators found this hard to believe. Robert described Jenny as happy and excited about their budding relationship. She had given no indication that she was planning to run away or disappear. Then came a critical breakthrough. At the end of July, police received a report about David Hodgson. He had been found in a ramshackle hut in the woods near Hodgswell, a village just outside Richmond. Hodgson had taken an overdose of pills washed down with wine. It appeared to be a suicide attempt, though he survived. When questioned afterward, Hodgson's story changed again. Now he admitted that, yes, he and Jenny had been lovers, but he insisted their affair had ended 12 months earlier, and he claimed to have no knowledge of her whereabouts. The discovery of Hodgson in that woodland hut was significant for another reason. It turned out that David and Robert Hodgson had built several of these crude shelters in Sandbeck Plantation, a densely wooded area south of Richmond near the A61-06 road. These huts were hidden deep in the forest, far from any established paths. They were private, secluded spots known only to the Hodgson brothers, and perhaps a few others. Investigators immediately began searching Sandbeck Plantation. And in March of 2006, 9 months after Jenny disappeared, they found something that changed everything. In one of the hidden woodland huts, officers discovered several of Jenny's personal belongings, her cassette player, the teddy bear she'd carried with her since childhood, and her nightdress. These were items Jenny had taken with her when she left home on June 30th. They were items that should have been with her wherever she was camping. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. Jenny's possessions proved she had been in that hut, and David Hodgson had lied repeatedly about taking Jenny to any of his woodland shelters. His denials were now proven false. But there was something even more damning: DNA evidence. Forensic scientists analyzed samples taken from the hut and from Jenny's belongings. They found biological evidence proving that both Jenny Nicholl and David Hodgson had been in that location together. The DNA findings directly contradicted Hodgson's claims that he hadn't seen Jenny in over a year. He had been with her in that hut, almost certainly on the night she disappeared. But still, there was no body. Police couldn't prove Jenny was dead, and they couldn't prove exactly what had happened in that woodland shelter. David Hodgson continued to deny any involvement in her disappearance, and his defense would likely argue that Jenny had simply run away, perhaps with someone else, after visiting the hut. Investigators needed more. They needed evidence so compelling that a jury would convict even without a body, and they found it in the most unlikely place, in the language of those text messages sent from Jenny's phone in the days after she vanished. As 2005 turned into 2006, and then into 2007, the investigation into Jenny Nicholl's disappearance remained technically open but effectively stalled. The case file sat on Detective Chief Inspector Pete Martin's desk, a constant reminder of justice delayed. For Jenny's parents, Brian and Ann Nicholl, the passage of time was excruciating. Imagine living in a state of perpetual limbo, where you can't grieve properly because there's no body to bury, no funeral to hold, no grave to visit. Every birthday, every Christmas, every ordinary Tuesday was poisoned by the absence of answers. Ann Nicholl kept her daughter's room exactly as Jenny had left it. The guitar still leaned against the wall. Clothes still hung in the closet. It was a shrine to hope and simultaneously a monument to loss. The Nicholls became advocates, appearing on television programs to keep Jenny's case in the public eye. In December of 2005, Anne appeared on the BBC's Crime Watch program, pleading directly to the camera for anyone with information to come forward. She asked for help finding her daughter. She asked for help finding her daughter's killer. Because by then, the family knew. Deep in their hearts, they understood that Jenny wasn't coming home alive. In November of 2005, North Yorkshire police had officially reclassified the investigation from a missing persons inquiry to a murder investigation. They believed Jenny had been killed on or shortly after June 30th, 2005. They believed David Hodgson was responsible. But belief isn't proof, and without proof they couldn't bring charges. David Hodgson, meanwhile, continued living his life in Richmond. He had survived his suicide attempt and returned to his home on Olive Road. He lived with his wife and daughters in the same small town, where Jenny's parents were grieving, where Jenny's friends were still searching for answers, where everyone knew something terrible had happened but couldn't quite name it. The case became one of those whispered stories in the community. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had heard rumors. Some locals believed Hodgson was guilty. Others wondered if Jenny had simply run away from what they now knew was an abusive home situation, according to Hodgson's claims. But those close to the investigation, those who knew the family, understood that the allegation of abuse was nothing more than a desperate defense tactic, entirely without foundation. Behind the scenes, however, investigators were working on something revolutionary. They were consulting with experts in a field that had rarely been used in criminal prosecutions: forensic linguistics. This is the scientific analysis of language patterns to determine authorship, intent, and authenticity. Just as every person has unique fingerprints, every person also has a unique linguistic fingerprint, a distinctive way of expressing themselves in writing and speech. Dr. Tim Grant, a forensic linguist from the University of Aston, was brought in to analyze the text messages sent from Jenny's phone after her disappearance. His task was to determine whether Jenny herself had written those messages or whether someone else had composed them in an attempt to make it appear she was still alive. Dr. Grant's analysis was meticulous. He examined every text message Jenny had sent before her disappearance, building a comprehensive profile of her linguistic style. He looked at her vocabulary choices, her grammar patterns, her use of punctuation, her preferred abbreviations, way she structured sentences, the topics she typically discussed, and even the emotional tone of her communication. Then he compared those genuine Jenny messages to the texts sent after June 30th. He also analyzed text messages and written communications from David Hodgson, creating a similar linguistic profile for the suspect. What Dr. Grant discovered was stunning. The messages sent from Jenny's phone after her disappearance bore virtually no resemblance to Jenny's actual writing style. Instead, they closely matched the linguistic patterns, vocabulary, and structural tendencies found in David Hodgson's communications. The differences were numerous and significant. Jenny typically used certain words and phrases that never appeared in the post-disappearance texts. Conversely, the fake messages contained vocabulary and constructions that Jenny never used, but that appeared regularly in Hodgson's writing. The punctuation was wrong, the abbreviation style was wrong, even the emotional register was wrong. Jenny wrote with warmth and openness. The fake messages were cold and distant. Dr. Grant's conclusion was unequivocal. The text messages sent from Jenny Nicholl's phone after June 30th, 2005 were not written by Jenny Nicholl. They were composed by David Hodgson in a deliberate attempt to deceive police and Jenny's family into believing she was still alive and had run away. This forensic linguistic evidence provided investigators with a crucial piece of the puzzle. But there was more. Police had also been analyzing cell tower data, the digital footprint left behind every time a mobile phone connects to a network. This data revealed the geographic locations where Jenny's phone had been when those fake messages were sent. On July 9th, messages were sent from a location near Carlisle, about 60 miles northwest of Richmond. On July 14th, messages were sent from near Jedburgh in the Scottish borders, about 70 miles north of Richmond. These were the locations Anne Nicholl had desperately traveled to, searching for her daughter. But investigators discovered something else. David Hodgson had hired a rental car on both July 9th and July 14th, 2005. The mileage logs from those rental vehicles showed distances that precisely matched a round trip from Richmond to Carlisle and a round trip from Richmond to Jedburgh. David Hodgson had physically traveled to those locations, carrying Jenny's phone, and sent fake messages to create the illusion that she was alive, camping in Scotland, and choosing not to contact her family. The pieces were falling into place. The DNA evidence placed Jenny and Hodgson together in the woodland hut. The forensic linguistics proved Hodgson had faked the messages from Jenny's phone. The cell tower and rental car data proved Hodgson had deliberately traveled to distant locations to send those fake messages and mislead the investigation. And the motive was crystal clear: jealous rage over Jenny's relationship with his brother. By the spring of 2007, nearly 2 years after Jenny vanished, prosecutors believed they had enough evidence to proceed without a body. This was an enormous legal gamble. No-body murder convictions are notoriously difficult to obtain. Defense attorneys can always argue that without a body, there's reasonable doubt about whether a murder even occurred. Maybe the supposed victim is alive somewhere, living under a new identity. Maybe they really did run away. Without physical proof of death, proving murder beyond reasonable doubt becomes an uphill battle. But the Crown Prosecution Service, after reviewing the evidence compiled by North Yorkshire Police, decided to move forward. On May 16, 2007, nearly 2 years after Jenny Nicholl disappeared, David Hodgson was formally charged with her murder. He was remanded in custody to await trial. The arrest shocked the Richmond community. Even those who had suspected Hodgson found it hard to believe that a murder charge could be brought without a body being found. Many wondered whether prosecutors were overreaching, whether the case would collapse in court. But investigators were confident. They knew they had built something unprecedented. A case based not on traditional physical evidence like blood spatter or ballistics, but on words, on language, on the digital traces left behind by deception. They were about to make legal history. The breakthrough in the Jenny Nicholl case wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was the culmination of patient, methodical investigative work combined with cutting-edge forensic science. But if there was one pivotal moment that transformed the case from cold to hot, it was the decision to bring forensic linguistics into the investigation. To understand why this was so revolutionary, you need to understand the context of criminal investigations in the early 2000s. DNA evidence had become well established. Fingerprint analysis was routine. Even digital forensics, examining computers and mobile phones for evidence, was becoming standard practice. But forensic linguistics, the scientific analysis of language to determine authorship and intent, was still considered experimental, borderline controversial. There had been a handful of cases in the United Kingdom where linguistic analysis played a role. The most notable was the murder of 15-year-old Danielle Jones in 2001. Her uncle, Stuart Campbell, was convicted of her murder despite her body never being found, partly based on forensic linguistic evidence showing that text messages, supposedly from Danielle, had actually been written by Campbell. That case established a precedent, but it was still relatively new legal territory. When Detective Chief Inspector Pete Martin and his team decided to pursue linguistic analysis of Jenny's text messages, they were taking a calculated risk. Would a jury understand the science? Would they find it convincing? Would the defense be able to dismantle it under cross-examination? These were all open questions. Dr. Tim Grant approached the analysis with scientific rigor. He began by collecting a corpus, a large sample, of Jenny's genuine text messages and other written communication. He analyzed her Facebook posts, her emails, her handwritten notes, every piece of writing that could be authenticated as definitely coming from Jenny herself. From this corpus, he identified consistent patterns. Jenny had a particular way of greeting people in texts. She used certain emoticons frequently. She had preferred abbreviations for common words. Her sentence structure tended toward the informal and conversational. She asked lots of questions. She used exclamation points liberally to convey enthusiasm. When discussing plans, she always included specific details and times. Her messages to family members had a warm, affectionate tone, often including terms of endearment. Then Dr. Grant examined the messages sent from Jenny's phone after June 30th. These messages were starkly different. They were terse and formal. They lacked Jenny's characteristic enthusiasm. There were no emoticons. The abbreviations used were not ones Jenny typically employed. The sentences were longer and more structured than Jenny's natural style. Most tellingly, the messages were vague about locations and plans, avoiding the specific details Jenny always included. And the tone toward family was distant, almost cold, completely unlike Jenny's usual warmth. But Dr. Grant didn't stop there. He then collected samples of David Hodgson's writing, his text messages, his emails, his posts on internet forums, his handwritten notes, and he found remarkable correlations. The linguistic features present in the fake Jenny messages closely matched Hodgson's own writing style. The vocabulary was Hodgson's vocabulary. The sentence structures reflected Hodgson's preferences. Even subtle grammatical choices matched Hodgson rather than Jenny. One particularly damning detail involved the use of apostrophes and contractions. Jenny consistently wrote don't without an apostrophe, while Hodgson always wrote don't with the apostrophe. The fake messages from Jenny after her disappearance all contained properly punctuated contractions matching Hodgson's style, not Jenny's. Another telling detail involved the way locations were described. When Jenny talked about going camping, she always mentioned specific place by name, going to Sandbeck, camping near Hudswell, down by the river. The fake messages were vague, camping in Scotland, need some time away, up north for a while. This vagueness served Hodgson's purpose of making it seem like Jenny had run away without pinpointing a location where police might actually find her. Dr. Grant prepared a detailed report quantifying these differences. Using statistical analysis, he calculated the probability that Jenny had written the post-disappearance messages. His conclusion was that it was statistically virtually impossible that Jenny had authored those texts. The linguistic evidence, he stated, strongly supported the hypothesis that David Hodgson had composed the messages using Jenny's phone. This linguistic analysis, combined with the other evidence, created a compelling narrative. David Hodgson had killed Jenny Nicholl on the evening of June 30th, 2005, likely in one of his woodland huts in Sandbeck Plantation. He had kept her phone. Then, after police interviewed him on July 9th, and he realized he was a suspect, he panicked. He needed to create evidence that Jenny was still alive. So he began sending fake text messages from her phone. But Hodgson was clever enough to know that cell tower data could place the phone's location. If messages were sent from Richmond, investigators would wonder why Jenny hadn't simply come home. So Hodgson hatched a plan. He hired rental cars and drove to distant locations, first Carlisle, then Jedburgh, both in Scotland or near the Scottish border. From those locations he sent messages designed to suggest Jenny had run away to Scotland and wanted to be left alone. Then he drove back to Richmond, returning the rental cars. Hodgson probably thought he was being brilliant, that his plan would fool the police indefinitely. What he didn't account for was the meticulous nature of modern digital forensics and the emerging field of forensic linguistics. He didn't realize that his own writing style would betray him, that every word choice, every punctuation mark, every grammatical construction would point back to him like an accusing finger. The forensic linguistic evidence was groundbreaking, but it was made even more powerful when combined with the other elements of the case. The DNA evidence proved Jenny and Hodgson had been together in the woodland hut. Her personal belongings, found at that location, proved she had been there on the night she disappeared. The rental car records and cell tower data proved Hodgson had traveled to the locations where the fake messages were sent. And the forensic linguistics proved he had written those messages. Each piece of evidence supported the others, creating a web of proof that was difficult to refute. This is what prosecutors call a circumstantial case, a case built not on one piece of direct evidence like an eyewitness or a confession, but on multiple pieces of indirect evidence that, when considered together, point inescapably to guilt. There was also the matter of motive. David Hodgson was intensely jealous and possessive. He had groomed Jenny since she was 14, maintaining control over her for years. When Jenny finally tried to break free by starting a relationship with Hodgson's own brother, it was the ultimate betrayal in Hodgson's mind. For a narcissist, for a man who needed to dominate and control, this loss of power would have been unbearable. Prosecutors would argue that Hodgson killed Jenny in a rage, unable to accept that she had moved on, unable to tolerate the humiliation of losing her to his own brother. By the time David Hodgson's trial began in January 2008, nearly 2.5 years after Jenny disappeared, the prosecution had assembled what they believed was an overwhelming case. But they still faced the fundamental challenge of all no-body prosecutions, proving beyond reasonable doubt that a murder had occurred when the victim's remains had never been found. The outcome was far from certain. The trial of David Hodgson for the murder of Jenny Nicholl began at Teesside Crown Court in mid-January 2008. The prosecution was led by experienced Crown barristers who understood the unique challenges of a no-body case. The defense, meanwhile, prepared to exploit the absence of Jenny's remains, arguing that, without a body, the Crown couldn't prove Jenny was even dead, let alone that she had been murdered. The courtroom was packed. Members of Jenny's family sat in the public gallery, their faces etched with years of grief and frustration. Media representatives from across the United Kingdom attended, recognizing that this case could set significant legal precedents. And David Hodgson sat in the dock, 48 years old by then, maintaining his innocent plea and showing little emotion as proceedings began. The prosecution's opening statement laid out their case methodically. They told the jury about Jenny Nicholl, a vibrant young woman with her whole life ahead of her. They described her close relationship with her family, her love of music and camping, her reliability and constant communication. They emphasized that Jenny was not the type of person to simply vanish without telling anyone. Then they introduced David Hodgson into the narrative, an older, married man who had groomed Jenny since she was 14, who had maintained an inappropriate sexual relationship with her for years, and who had become consumed with jealousy when Jenny began seeing his brother. The prosecution walked the jury through the timeline of June 30th, 2005, Jenny leaving home with camping gear, her car being found abandoned, the initial missing persons investigation, then the crucial developments, Hodgson being interviewed by police, and immediately afterward, text messages beginning to arrive from Jenny's phone claiming she was in Scotland. The Crown then began presenting their evidence, piece by piece. First came testimony from Jenny's family and friends, establishing her character and the close relationships she maintained. Brian Nicholl, Jenny's father, took the stand and delivered emotional testimony about his daughter. He described her as trustworthy, independent, but always in touch. He spoke about the agony of the past 2.5 years, not knowing what had happened, unable to give his daughter a proper burial. He also firmly rebutted the defense's anticipated claim that Jenny had run away from an abusive home, stating unequivocally that no such abuse had ever occurred and that Jenny had been happy at home. Anne Nicholl, Jenny's mother, testified about the last time she saw her daughter. She described Jenny kissing her goodbye, loading camping gear into her white Rover, and driving away. Anne spoke about the text messages that arrived days later. Messages that initially gave her hope, but that never quite sounded like her daughter. She described traveling to Carlisle and Jedburgh, desperately searching for any sign of Jenny, finding nothing. The prosecution then called friends of Jenny who described her relationship with David Hodgson. They testified that Jenny had been trying to end things with Hodgson for some time, that she felt trapped and controlled. They spoke about Jenny's new relationship with Robert Hodgson and how happy it had made her. One friend testified that Jenny had expressed fear about how David would react if he found out about her and Robert. Robert Hodgson himself took the stand. He confirmed his relationship with Jenny and stated that she had never mentioned any plans to run away. He described Jenny as excited about their future together. Robert also testified that he had not known about his brother's history with Jenny until after she disappeared, a claim that prosecutors clearly doubted but couldn't definitively disprove. Then came the forensic evidence. Police officers described finding Jenny's car abandoned at the Holly Hill pub. They detailed the extensive searches conducted across North Yorkshire, the deployment of specialized resources, the examination of more than 150 locations. They testified about finding Jenny's possessions in the woodland hut in Sandbeck Plantation, the cassette player, the teddy bear, the nightdress. Forensic scientists took the stand to explain the DNA evidence. Using charts and scientific language translated for the jury, they explained how biological samples from the hut had been analyzed. They testified that DNA matching Jenny Nicholl and DNA matching David Hodgson had both been found in that location, proving conclusively that the two of them had been there together. This directly contradicted Hodgson's repeated claims that he hadn't seen Jenny in over a year. The prosecution then presented the cell tower data. A telecommunications expert explained how mobile phones constantly communicate with nearby cell towers, leaving a digital trail of their approximate location. The expert walked the jury through the data from Jenny's phone, showing that after June 30th, the phone had traveled from Richmond to Carlisle on July 9th, then to Jedburgh on July 14th. Maps were displayed showing the cell towers that had connected with Jenny's phone at those times. Next came the rental car evidence. Prosecutors presented records showing that David Hodgson had hired vehicles on July 9th and July 14th. They showed the mileage records from those rentals. A transportation expert testified that the distances matched almost exactly the round trip mileage from Richmond to Carlisle and from Richmond to Jedburgh, respectively. The implication was clear. Hodgson had driven to those locations specifically to send fake text messages from Jenny's phone, creating the illusion that she was alive and in Scotland. Then came the piece de resistance. Dr. Tim Grant, the forensic linguist. Dr. Grant spent considerable time on the stand explaining the science of forensic linguistics to the jury. He used clear, accessible language to describe how every person had a unique linguistic fingerprint, just as distinctive as their DNA. He explained the methodology he had used, collecting genuine samples of Jenny's writing, identifying her consistent patterns, then comparing those patterns to the post-disappearance messages. Dr. Grant presented side-by-side comparisons on large screens in the courtroom. He showed Jenny's typical greeting, "Hiya hun," versus the fake message greeting, "Hello." He showed Jenny's characteristic use of multiple exclamation points and emoticons versus the fake message's bland, emotionless tone. He demonstrated the vocabulary differences, the grammatical differences, the structural differences. He walked the jury through his statistical analysis, explaining that the probability of Jenny having written the fake messages was infinitesimally small. Then Dr. Grant presented his analysis of David Hodgson's writing. He showed how the fake Jenny messages closely matched Hodgson's linguistic patterns. The vocabulary was Hodgson's. The grammar was Hodgson's. Even the spelling and punctuation choices matched Hodgson, not Jenny. Dr. Grant's conclusion, delivered with scientific authority, was that David Hodgson had authored the text messages sent from Jenny Nicholl's phone after her disappearance. The prosecution also presented evidence of David Hodgson's state of mind in the weeks following Jenny's disappearance. They called witnesses who described his suicide attempt at the end of July 2005, when he was found in a woodland hut having overdosed on pills and wine. Prosecutors argued this was the act of a guilty man overwhelmed by what he had done, not an innocent person. The Crown's case took several weeks to present. Each piece of evidence was carefully explained, each witness thoroughly examined. The prosecution was building a mosaic, each tile small on its own but together creating an undeniable picture. By the time they rested their case, they had presented a narrative that seemed compelling. David Hodgson had killed Jenny Nicholl in a jealous rage, hidden her body where it would never be found, and then attempted to cover up the murder by faking text messages to make it appear she had run away. When the prosecution rested, attention turned to the defense. David Hodgson's legal team faced an uphill battle. But they had one significant advantage: the absence of Jenny's body. They would argue that without a body, without a crime scene, without direct evidence of death, the Crown had not proven beyond reasonable doubt that a murder had even occurred, let alone that David Hodgson was responsible. The defense's strategy centered on creating reasonable doubt. They put forward an alternative narrative: Jenny Nicholl had run away from home voluntarily. Why? The defense made the controversial and deeply hurtful claim that Jenny had been abused at home by her father, Brian Nicholl, and that she had fled to escape that abuse. This allegation was not supported by any credible evidence, and was vehemently denied by Jenny's family and friends, but the defense hoped it would plant seeds of doubt in jurors' minds. The defense called their own witnesses, including David Hodgson's elder daughter. In a dramatic moment, she testified that she had seen Jenny alive in Richmond 2 days after her supposed disappearance, on July 2, 2005. According to this witness, Jenny had been with Robert Hodgson at that time. If true, this testimony would completely undermine the prosecution's timeline and suggest that Jenny had indeed been alive days after the Crown claimed she was murdered. But the prosecution was ready for this. They cross-examined the daughter vigorously, pointing out inconsistencies in her account. Why had she not reported this crucial sighting to police at the time? Why had her story changed in subsequent statements? The prosecution also recalled Robert Hodgson to the stand. Under oath, Robert firmly denied seeing Jenny after June 30th. He stated categorically that his brother's daughter was either mistaken or lying to protect her father. The defense also attempted to challenge the forensic linguistic evidence. They brought their own linguistic expert who testified that text message authorship analysis was not an exact science. The people's writing styles can vary depending on context and emotional state, and that the differences between Jenny's genuine messages and the post-disappearance message could potentially be explained by Jenny being in a different emotional state, under stress, or deliberately trying to sound different to discourage her family from searching for her. But on cross-examination, the prosecution's experts held firm. Dr. Tim Grant testified that while linguistic patterns can show some variation, the differences in this case were far too extensive and consistent to be explained by contextual factors. He stood by his conclusion: David Hodgson had written those messages, not Jenny Nicholl. The defense tried to attack the circumstantial nature of the prosecution's case. They argued that DNA in the woodland hut only proved Jenny and Hodgson had been there at some point, not necessarily on June 30th. They argued that the rental car evidence was merely coincidental, that Hodgson could have had innocent reasons for those trips. They argued that the suicide attempt proved nothing about guilt. It could have been the act of a depressed man dealing with the stress of being a suspect in a high-profile case. Then David Hodgson himself took the stand. This was a risky move by the defense, as it opened Hodgson up to cross-examination by the prosecution. But the defense clearly felt they needed Hodgson to tell his version of events directly to the jury. Hodgson testified that he'd cared deeply for Jenny, that their relationship, while inappropriate, had been genuine and consensual. He admitted lying to police initially about the nature of their relationship, claiming he had been embarrassed and frightened. He claimed that Jenny had ended their relationship a year before her disappearance, and that he had accepted it, though he remained fond of her. Hodgson testified that on June 30th, 2005, he had been with a woman friend that evening, and had not seen Jenny at all. He claimed that woman could provide an alibi, though when prosecutors actually interviewed her, she refuted Hodgson's claim and stated firmly that she had not been with him that night. This contradiction would prove devastating. Regarding the text messages, Hodgson claimed he had nothing to do with them. He suggested that perhaps Jenny really had sent them, or perhaps someone else entirely was involved, someone the police hadn't identified. When asked about the linguistic evidence showing the messages matched his writing style, Hodgson had no convincing explanation. He simply denied writing them. When asked about the rental cars and the coincidence of the distances matching trip to Carlisle and Jedburgh, exactly when messages were sent from those locations, Hodgson claimed he had made those trips for innocent reasons: to visit friends, to clear his head, to get away from the stress of being a suspect. The jury watched skeptically as he struggled to explain these remarkable coincidences. The prosecution's cross-examination of David Hodgson was methodical and brutal. They walked him through every lie he had told police. They confronted him with the DNA evidence. They asked him to explain why Jenny's possessions were found in his woodland hut if he hadn't seen her in a year. They asked him to explain the linguistic evidence. They asked him to explain the rental car evidence. With each question, Hodgson's answers became less convincing, more evasive. The prosecutor asked Hodgson directly about his jealousy over Jenny's relationship with his brother. Hodgson denied being jealous, claiming he had moved on. But the prosecution presented testimony from witnesses who said Hodgson had been visibly angry and upset when he learned about Jenny and Robert, that he felt betrayed and humiliated, Hodgson had no effective response. By the time Hodgson left the stand, his testimony had likely done more harm than good to his case. He had been caught in multiple contradictions. His alibis had fallen apart. His explanations for the evidence against him strained credulity. The jury had seen him attempt to shift blame, make excuses, and refuse to take responsibility. It was not the performance of an innocent man. In closing arguments, the prosecution brought everything together. They reviewed the evidence piece by piece: the DNA, the possessions, the fake text message, the linguistic analysis, the rental cars, the cell tower data, the motive, the lies. They argued that the only reasonable conclusion was that David Hodgson had murdered Jenny Nicholl on June 30, 2005, likely strangling her, or killing her by other means that left no obvious trace, and had then hidden her body so effectively that despite extensive searches it had never been found. The prosecution acknowledged that they could not tell the jury exactly where Jenny's body was, or precisely how she had died, but they argued that the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. They reminded the jury that no body convictions, while rare, were legally valid when the evidence of guilt was sufficiently strong. They urged the jury to deliver justice for Jenny and her family. The defense's closing argument emphasized reasonable doubt. They argued that without a body, without a crime scene, without witnesses to any violence, the Crown had not met its burden of proof. They urged the jury to acquit, suggesting that while Hodgson had made mistakes and told lies, those things did not make him a murderer. The judge, Mr. Justice Openshaw, then delivered his instructions to the jury. He explained the law regarding no-body murder cases. He told the jury they could convict if they were satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that Jenny was dead and that David Hodgson had killed her unlawfully. He explained that circumstantial evidence could be sufficient for conviction if it was strong enough and all pieces pointed to the same conclusion. He instructed the jury to consider all the evidence carefully and dispassionately. On February 18, 2008, the jury retired to begin their deliberation. Jenny's family waited, along with investigators, lawyers, and the media. After years of investigation, months of preparation, and weeks of trial, the case was final in the hands of 12 ordinary citizens, who would decide whether justice would be served. The jury deliberated for less than a day. On February 19, 2008, word spread through Teesside Crown Court that a verdict had been reached. Jenny's family rushed back to the courtroom. Media representatives scrambled into position. David Hodgson was brought up from the cells to the dock. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Everyone rose as Mr. Justice Openshaw entered. The jury filed in, their faces giving nothing away. The court clerk asked the foreperson if they had reached a verdict, upon which they were all agreed. The foreperson stood and confirmed that they had. The clerk asked for the verdict on the charge of murder. There was a moment of profound silence, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat, where time seems to suspend itself. Guilty. The word hung in the air, reverberating through the courtroom. Jenny's mother, Ann Nicholl, collapsed into her husband's arms, years of anguish erupting in tears. Other family members wept openly. David Hodgson showed no visible reaction, standing motionless in the dock, his face a mask. Police officers who had worked the case for nearly 3 years embraced each other, overcome with relief and vindication. It was a landmark moment in British criminal justice. David Hodgson had been convicted of murder despite the absence of Jenny's body, despite there being no crime scene, despite there being no witness to the killing itself. The conviction was secured through a combination of DNA evidence, digital forensics, rental car records, cell tower data, and groundbreaking forensic linguistic analysis. It proved that even without a body, meticulous investigative work and modern forensic science could deliver justice. Mr. Justice Openshaw addressed the court. He praised the jury for their careful consideration of complex evidence. He praised the police and prosecutors for their thorough and professional work. Then he turned his attention to David Hodgson. The judge stated that Hodgson had killed Jenny Nicholl in a jealous rage, had hidden her body to prevent its discovery, and had then engaged in an elaborate deception involving fake text messages to mislead police and Jenny's family. He described Hodgson's actions as calculated, cruel, and cowardly. Sentencing would take place the following day, February 20, 2008. Before Hodgson was taken back to the cells, Jenny's family members looked directly at him, hoping for some sign of remorse, some acknowledgement of what he had done. There was none. Hodgson remained silent and expressionless, maintaining his facade even in the face of conviction. The media coverage of the verdict was extensive. Headlines across the United Kingdom proclaimed the successful no-body prosecution. Legal experts analyzed the case, noting its potential as a precedent for future prosecutions. The forensic linguistic evidence, in particular, generated significant discussion. Dr. Tim Grant gave interviews explaining his methodology, and the case sparked renewed interest in the field of forensic linguistics. The next day, Hodgson returned to court for sentencing. Mr. Justice Openshaw delivered a sentencing statement that pulled no punches. He reviewed the facts of the case, emphasizing the grooming that had begun when Jenny was just 14, the possessive and controlling nature of Hodgson's relationship with her, and the murderous rage that had consumed him when he realized he had lost control. The judge then addressed the impact on Jenny's family. He spoke about the cruelty of not knowing where Jenny's body was, of being unable to give her a proper burial, of living in permanent limbo between hope and despair. He noted that David Hodgson had maintained his innocence throughout, refusing to provide any information about what he had done with Jenny's remains. This refusal, the judge said, compounded the suffering of Jenny's family and demonstrated Hodgson's complete lack of remorse or humanity. For the crime of murder, David Hodgson was sentenced to life imprisonment, as is mandatory in the United Kingdom for murder convictions. The critical question was the minimum term he would serve before becoming eligible for parole consideration. The judge set this at 18 years. This meant that Hodgson would not even be considered for parole until 2026 at the earliest, when he would be in his mid-60s, and given his refusal to reveal the location of Jenny's body, actual release might never come. As the sentence was pronounced, David Hodgson finally showed a flicker of emotion, a brief tightening around his eyes, a moment of realization that he would likely die in prison. Then the mask returned. He was led away by prison officers, down the stairs from the dock, beginning what would likely be the rest of his life behind bars. Outside the court, Detective Chief Inspector Pete Martin addressed the media. He praised his investigative team and the prosecutors. He acknowledged the pioneering role of forensic linguistics in securing the conviction. But mostly, he spoke about Jenny. He described her as a vibrant young woman whose life had been stolen far too soon. He expressed hope that even without Jenny's body being found, her family could now begin to find some measure of closure, some way to move forward knowing that justice had been served. Anne and Brian Nicholl also spoke to the press. Through tears, Anne said that while the conviction brought some relief, nothing could bring Jenny back. She made a direct plea to David Hodgson, asking him to show a shred of decency and tell them where he had hidden Jenny's body so they could finally lay their daughter to rest. That plea fell on deaf ears. Hodgson never revealed where Jenny's remains were, and to this day, nearly 2 decades later, her body has never been recovered. The conviction of David Hodgson sent ripples through the British justice system. It demonstrated that no-body prosecutions could succeed when supported by strong circumstantial evidence and modern forensic techniques. It validated the use of forensic linguistics in criminal trials, and it provided a template for future cases where victims had disappeared without a trace, but where circumstantial evidence pointed clearly to murder. The trial of David Hodgson, which concluded in February 2008, represented more than just the resolution of one tragic case. It marked a significant evolution in how British courts approached the challenge of prosecuting murders where no body had been found. To truly understand the impact, we need to examine the courtroom proceedings in greater detail and explore how each element of evidence was presented and received. The trial lasted more than 5 weeks, an unusually long duration that reflected the complexity of the case and the volume of circumstantial evidence. Unlike trials with direct evidence, such as eyewitnesses or confessions, circumstantial cases require prosecutors to methodically build a narrative from many smaller pieces. Each piece might be challenged by the defense as ambiguous or explicable in innocent terms, but when assembled together, these pieces can create an undeniable picture of guilt. The prosecution, understanding this dynamic, structured their case like a carefully constructed argument, each section building on the previous one. They started with establishing who Jenny was, creating a 3-dimensional portrait of a real person with dreams, relationships, and a future that was stolen from her. This humanization is crucial in any murder trial, but especially in a no-body case where the victim's physical absence might make them feel abstract or less real to jurors. Family members and friends testified about Jenny's character, her habits, her reliability. They established that she would never have voluntarily cut off all contact with her family. This testimony preemptively countered the defense's later argument that Jenny might have run away. Multiple witnesses stated emphatically, Jenny disappearing without explanation was completely out of character. If she was gone and silent, something terrible must have happened. The prosecution then established the timeline of June 30th, 2005. They traced Jenny's movements that day through witness statements and CCTV footage. She had been seen in Richmond. She had withdrawn money from an ATM. She had told her parents she was going camping. And then, at approximately 6:30 in the evening, all confirmed sightings ceased. It was as if Jenny had stepped off the edge of the world. The introduction of David Hodgson into the narrative was handled carefully. Prosecutors didn't want to simply demonize him. They wanted to explain the relationship in context. Expert testimony was provided about grooming, how older predators identify vulnerable young people, how they build trust, how they create relationships where the power dynamic is fundamentally unequal, how they maintain control through manipulation and psychological pressure. In Jenny's case, this grooming had begun when she was just 14. Hodgson was 42 at the time, nearly 3 times her age. He used his position as a local DJ, someone with perceived status and access to the music scene Jenny loved, to gain her trust. The relationship became sexual when Jenny was 16, technically legal but profoundly inappropriate given the history of grooming and the age difference. Friends of Jenny testified about how the relationship had affected her. Some hadn't owned the full extent of what was happening, but they noticed changes in Jenny's behavior during her mid to late teens. She became more secretive. She sometimes seemed anxious or depressed. She occasionally had unexplained absences or made excuses about where she was going. Looking back, these witnesses said, the signs of an abusive relationship were there, but they hadn't fully understood them at the time. The prosecution established that by 2005, Jenny was trying to extricate herself from Hodgson's control. She had started seeing Robert Hodgson, David's brother. Whether this was genuine affection or an attempt to find protection from David through someone David might not openly challenge, we'll never know for certain. But it's clear that this new relationship represented Jenny attempting to move forward with her life, to escape the toxic dynamic with David. David Hodgson's reaction to learning about Jenny and Robert was, according to witnesses, explosive. One friend testified about seeing David confronting Jenny outside the supermarket where she worked. He was visibly angry, his voice raised, his body language aggressive. Jenny looked frightened. The friend intervened and David stormed away, but not before making a comment that haunted investigators. You'll regret this. This threat became crucial to establishing motive. The prosecution didn't need to prove premeditation, but they needed to show why David Hodgson would want Jenny dead. The answer was a toxic combination of jealousy, possessiveness, wounded pride, and humiliation. In Hodgson's mind, Jenny belonged to him. Her choosing his own brother was the ultimate betrayal, an insult he could not tolerate. The forensic evidence portion of the trial was particularly compelling. When police found Jenny's possessions in the woodland hut in Sandbeck Plantation 9 months after her disappearance, it transformed the case. The cassette player, the teddy bear, the night dress, these were items Jenny had taken with her on June 30th. Their presence in Hodgson's secret hut proved she had been there. But the DNA evidence was even more powerful. Forensic scientists testified about finding biological samples in the hut that matched both Jenny and David. The defense tried to argue that this merely proved they had been in the hut at some point, not necessarily on June 30th, or that anything sinister had occurred. But the prosecution countered, effectively, why would Jenny's camping items be in the hut if she hadn't been there on the night she disappeared? And why had David repeatedly lied about taking Jenny to any of his woodland locations if the encounter was innocent? The rental car evidence tied everything together. Prosecutors presented detailed records showing that Hodgson had hired vehicles on July 9th and July 14th, 2005. The mileage on those vehicles was recorded at the start and end of each rental. A transportation expert testified that the distance traveled on July 9th matched a round trip from Richmond to Carlisle. The distance traveled on July 14th matched a round trip from Richmond to Jedburgh. These weren't approximate matches, they were remarkably precise. The prosecution then overlaid this with the cell tower data. Jenny's phone had connected to towers near Carlisle on July 9th, when text messages were sent. It had connected to towers near Jedburgh on July 14th, when more messages were sent. The correlation was undeniable. David Hodgson had physically driven to those locations, carrying Jenny's phone, and sent fake messages to create the illusion she was alive and camping in Scotland. But why go to such lengths? The prosecution explained the logic. If messages came from Richmond, police would immediately wonder why Jenny hadn't come home. If they came from somewhere local but Jenny couldn't be found, it would look suspicious. But if they came from distant locations in Scotland, it would support a narrative that Jenny had run away, was deliberately avoiding her family, and wanted to be left alone. Hodgson was trying to buy time, to deflect suspicion, to create an explanation for Jenny's absence that didn't point to murder. The forensic linguistic testimony from Dr. Tim Grant was the centerpiece of the trial. Dr. Grant spent hours on the stand, patiently explaining his methodology to the jury. He used visual aids extensively, showing side-by-side comparisons of Jenny's genuine messages and the fake messages. The differences were striking once they were pointed out. Where Jenny wrote hiya, the fake messages said hello. Where Jenny used multiple exclamation points and emoticons to convey enthusiasm, The fake messages were flat and emotionless. Where Jenny's sentences were short and conversational, the fake messages were longer and more formal. Dr. Grant also demonstrated vocabulary differences. Jenny regularly used certain colloquial terms and slang expressions common among her peer group. These never appeared in the fake messages. Conversely, the fake messages contained words and phrases that appeared regularly in David Hodgson's communications but never in Jenny's. The statistical probability of these patterns occurring by chance was infinitesimally small. The defense's cross-examination of Dr. Grant attempted to undermine the certainty of his conclusion. Defense attorneys asked whether emotional state could affect someone's writing style. Dr. Grant acknowledged that people do write differently under stress, but he explained that the differences in this case went far beyond what could be attributed to emotional state. The fake messages didn't just reflect a different mood, they reflected a fundamentally different author. The defense also tried to challenge the scientific validity of forensic linguistics itself. They suggested it was a newer field, not as well established as DNA analysis or fingerprinting. Dr. Grant countered by explaining that linguistic analysis has been used in authorship attribution for centuries, and that modern forensic linguistics simply applies scientific rigor and statistical methods to long-standing analytical techniques. He cited previous cases, including the Danielle Jones murder, where forensic linguistic evidence had been accepted by courts and contributed to convictions. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial came when the prosecution played back testimony from interviews with David Hodgson, showing how his story had changed over time. Initially, he denied knowing Jenny well. Then he admitted they were friends. Then he admitted they'd had a sexual relationship, but claimed it ended a year before her disappearance. Then he admitted being in contact with her more recently, but denied seeing her on June 30th. Each shift in his narrative eroded his credibility. The prosecution also highlighted Hodgson's failed alibi. He'd claimed to be with a woman friend on the evening of June 30th, implying she could vouch for his whereabouts. But when police interviewed this woman, she stated categorically that she had not been with Hodgson that evening. Confronted with this contradiction, Hodgson claimed he had been confused about dates. But the jury could see the pattern. Hodgson lied, was caught in the lie, and then made excuses. The defense's case, as mentioned, centered on creating reasonable doubt and offering alternative explanations. They brought forward Hodgson's daughter, who claimed to have seen Jenny alive on July 2nd. This testimony, if believed, would have destroyed the prosecution's timeline, but under cross-examination, the witness's credibility crumbled. She couldn't provide specific details about where or when she'd supposedly seen Jenny. Her account contradicted statements she'd given earlier to police. And Robert Hodgson, who she claimed Jenny was with, directly refuted her story. The defense also tried to paint Jenny as unstable, unhappy at home, someone who might plausibly have run away. But every witness who actually knew Jenny, including teachers, employers, friends, and extended family members, contradicted this characterization. Jenny was described consistently as happy, well-adjusted, excited about her future, and deeply connected to her family. The defense's portrayal simply didn't match reality. In the end, the trial came down to a fundamental question: could the jury be convinced beyond reasonable doubt that Jenny was dead and that David Hodgson had killed her, despite never seeing her body or a crime scene? The answer, delivered in their guilty verdict, was yes. The circumstantial evidence was simply too strong, too consistent, and too compelling to interpret any other way. The conviction of David Hodgson resonated far beyond the courtroom at Teesside Crown Court. It represented a victory not just for Jenny's family, but for a principle that murder cannot go unpunished simply because a killer is clever enough or lucky enough to hide their victim's body. In the days and weeks following the verdict, the case sparked important conversation about justice, forensic science, and the rights of victims' families. For Anne and Brian Nicholl, the conviction brought a complex mixture of emotions. There was relief that Jenny's killer had been held accountable, that the man who had groomed their daughter and ultimately taken her life would spend decades in prison. There was vindication that their insistence Jenny had not simply run away had been validated. There was gratitude to the police officers and prosecutors who had worked tirelessly for nearly 3 years to build a case that could succeed without the traditional evidence of a body. But there was also profound, ongoing grief. The conviction didn't bring Jenny back. It didn't tell them exactly what had happened in that woodland hut on June 30th, 2005. Most painfully, it didn't reveal where David Hodgson had hidden Jenny's remains. Even after his conviction, even facing life imprisonment, Hodgson refused to say where Jenny's body was. This final cruelty meant the Nicholls couldn't give their daughter a proper burial. They couldn't visit a grave. They couldn't have that small measure of closure that comes from being able to lay flowers at a headstone. In November 2009, nearly 4.5 years after Jenny disappeared, a coroner held an inquest and formally recorded a verdict of unlawful killing. This legal declaration confirmed what everyone already knew: Jenny Nicholl was dead, and her death was a homicide. The inquest also provided a forum for the Nicholls to make another public plea to David Hodgson, begging him to reveal where he had hidden their daughter. The plea, delivered through tears, was heartbreaking in its simplicity. "Please, just tell us where she is so we can bring her home." Hodgson, serving his sentence at HMP Franklin, one of Britain's high-security prisons, remained silent. He has maintained his silence ever since. In the years that followed, Jenny's parents had to endure another layer of anguish, knowing that Hodgson, having served his minimum term, would eventually become eligible for parole consideration. The thought of him potentially being released while still refusing to reveal what he had done with Jenny's body was unbearable. This issue, the release of murderers who won't disclose their victims' locations, wasn't unique to Jenny's case. It had been a source of pain for many families over the years. One of the most prominent examples was Marie MC Court, whose daughter Helen had disappeared in 1988. Helen's killer, Ian Sims, was convicted but never revealed where he had hidden her body. When Sims became eligible for parole, Marie Mac Court launched a campaign arguing that killers who refused to disclose their victims' whereabouts should not be granted parole. Marie Mac Court's campaign gained traction, and the Nicholl family joined it. Together with other families in similar situations, they lobbied Parliament for a change in the law. They argued that refusing to reveal a victim's location demonstrates a lack of remorse and should be considered a factor weighing against parole. They called the proposed legislation Helen's Law, in honor of Helen Mac Court. After years of campaigning, Helen's Law was finally passed in July 2019. The law didn't create an absolute bar to parole for offenders who won't reveal body locations, but it required parole boards to consider this refusal as evidence of a lack of remorse when making release decisions. For the Nicholl family, this was a bittersweet victory. It wouldn't bring Jenny back, but it would make it significantly harder for David Hodgson to ever be released. In April 2025, David Hodgson became one of the first murderers denied parole under Helen's Law. His refusal to reveal where he had hidden Jenny's body was cited specifically as a key factor in the parole board's decision to keep him in prison. The Nicholls welcomed the decision but reiterated their plea. They didn't want Hodgson punished for punishment's sake. They just wanted to know where Jenny was, so they could finally lay her to rest. The Jenny Nicholl case also had significant impact on forensic science, particularly forensic linguistics. In September 2008, just months after Hodgson's conviction, the Council for the Registration of Forensic Practitioners officially recognized forensic linguistics as a specialty. This recognition elevated the field's status and encouraged more research and development of analytical techniques. Dr. Tim Grant's work on the Jenny Nicholl case became a textbook example used in university courses on forensic linguistics. His methodology has been refined and applied in subsequent cases around the world. The case demonstrated that text message analysis could be powerful evidence when conducted with scientific rigor and presented clearly to juries. The broader legal community also took note. Law enforcement agencies began incorporating linguistic analysis into investigations more routinely. Prosecutors became more willing to bring no-body murder cases when supported by strong circumstantial evidence. Defense attorneys had to take forensic linguistics seriously rather than dismissing it as pseudoscience. For the community of Richmond, North Yorkshire, the trial and conviction brought an end to years of speculation and rumor. Everyone had known something terrible had happened to Jenny. Everyone had suspected David Hodgson, but until the trial, there had been no official resolution, no public accountability. The conviction allowed the community to collectively acknowledge what had occurred and to remember Jenny not as a missing person or a mystery, but as a vibrant young woman whose life was stolen by someone she had trusted. Memorials were held for Jenny in Richmond. A tree was planted in her memory in a local park. Her old bandmates performed tribute concerts, playing the songs Jenny had loved. The local supermarket where she had worked created a scholarship in her name for young people pursuing careers in music. These tributes couldn't ease the pain of her loss, but they ensured Jenny would be remembered, not as a victim, but as the talented, adventurous, music-loving person she had been. The case also prompted reflection on the issue of grooming and inappropriate relationships between adults and teenagers. While Jenny had been 16, the age of consent, when the relationship became sexual, the grooming had begun. When she was 14, this raised questions about whether the law adequately protected young people from predatory adults who use grooming tactics to establish control before the relationship turned sexual. Schools in North Yorkshire used Jenny's case as part of their safeguarding education, teaching students about recognizing inappropriate adult attention, understanding power imbalances in relationships, and knowing where to seek help. The goal was to ensure that other young people wouldn't fall prey to predators like David Hodgson. For Jenny's parents, life continued in the shadow of loss. They became advocates not just for Helen's Law, but for broader support for families of murder victims, particularly those in no-body cases who face unique challenges. They spoke at conferences, participated in documentary programs, and worked with victim support organizations. They channeled their grief into action, determined that some good should come from their unimaginable loss. Ann Nicholl, in interviews years after the conviction, spoke about the strange state of limbo she inhabited. On one hand, she knew Jenny was dead. The court had said so. The evidence was overwhelming, but without a body, without having said final goodbye, some part of her brain refused to fully accept it. She described it as living in two realities simultaneously, the rational reality where Jenny was gone, and the emotional reality where hope persisted irrationally. It was, she said, a special kind of torture that only families in similar situations could truly understand. The murder of Jenny Nicholl and the subsequent conviction of David Hodgson continue to resonate within the British criminal justice system nearly 2 decades later. The case stands as a landmark for several reasons, each contributing to its lasting significance and its continuing influence on how murders, particularly those without recovered bodies, are investigated and prosecuted. First and foremost, the case demonstrated conclusively that no-body murder prosecutions can succeed when supported by meticulous investigative work and modern forensic techniques. Before cases like Jenny's, there was significant reluctance among prosecutors to bring charges without a body. The conventional wisdom was that without direct proof of death, creating reasonable doubt would be too easy for defense attorneys. Juries, it was thought, would be too skeptical to convict. But the Nicholl case, along with a handful of others prosecuted around the same time, proved that conventional wisdom wrong. When circumstantial evidence is strong, consistent, and comprehensive, juries are capable of reaching beyond reasonable doubt conclusions, even without seeing a body. This realization emboldened prosecutors to pursue cases they might previously have deemed unwinnable. Killers could no longer count on hiding a body as a guaranteed defense against conviction. The forensic linguistic evidence was particularly groundbreaking. Prior to the Nicholl case, linguistic analysis was rarely used in criminal prosecutions and was sometimes viewed with skepticism by courts. Dr. Tim Grant's testimony and the way it resonated with the jury legitimized the field. Forensic linguistics moved from the periphery of forensic science to the mainstream. Today, linguistic analysis is routinely considered in cases involving text messages, emails, ransom notes, suicide notes, social media posts, and any other form of written communication where authorship or authenticity is in question. The techniques Dr. Grant pioneered and refined have been adopted by law enforcement agencies worldwide. Academic programs in forensic linguistics have expanded, training a new generation of experts who can bring scientific rigor to the analysis of language in legal contexts. The case also highlighted the critical importance of digital forensics in modern investigation. The cell tower data that tracked Jenny's phone to Carlisle and Jedburgh, the rental car records that proved Hodgson had made those exact trips. The analysis of call logs and message timestamps. All of this represented a relatively new frontier in criminal investigation in the early 2000s. Law enforcement learned from the Nicholl case that digital footprints can be as revealing as physical evidence, sometimes more so. Today, digital forensics is a cornerstone of virtually every major criminal investigation. Police routinely obtain cell tower data, GPS records, internet search histories, and social media activity. The Nicholl case was an early and influential example of how powerful this evidence could be when properly analyzed and presented. The case also had a broader cultural impact on awareness of grooming and predatory relationships. The fact that David Hodgson had begun grooming Jenny when she was just 14, that he had used his status and access to music scene to gain influence over her, that he had isolated her and made her keep their relationship secret, all of these are classic grooming tactics that are now much more widely understood and recognized. Schools, youth organizations, and child protection services use cases like Jenny's to educate young people and parents about warning signs. The narrative of Jenny's case makes clear that grooming isn't a single incident but a process, a gradual establishment of control that makes it difficult for the victim to recognize what's happening or to escape. By the time Jenny was trying to extricate herself from Hodgson's control at age 19, she had been under his influence for 5 years. Breaking free from that kind of psychological grip is extraordinarily difficult. The passage of Helen's Law, which the Nicholl family helped campaign for, represents another lasting impact of Jenny's case. The law ensures that murderers who refuse to disclose their victims' locations face additional barriers to release. It acknowledges that this particular form of cruelty, denying families the ability to recover and bury their loved ones, demonstrates an absence of remorse that should be factored into parole decisions. Since Helen's Law was enacted, several killers have been denied parole, specifically because of their refusal to reveal body locations. David Hodgson was among the first. This doesn't guarantee he'll never be released, but it makes release far less likely as long as he maintains his silence. For families in the agonizing position of the Nicholls, this provides at least some measure of justice and protection. The case also prompted reflection within law enforcement about cold cases and the importance of not giving up. Jenny's case was actively investigated for nearly 3 years before charges were brought. During that time, there were undoubtedly moments when investigators wondered if they were wasting resources, if they would ever be able to build a prosecutable case without a body. But Detective Chief Inspector Pete Martin and his team persevered, following every lead, analyzing every piece of evidence, consulting with experts in emerging forensic fields. Their persistence paid off with a conviction that set precedents and brought justice. The lesson for law enforcement was clear. Even the most challenging cases can be solved with dedication, modern forensic techniques, and creative investigative thinking. This encouraged police departments to re-examine their own cold cases, to apply new technologies and methodologies to old unsolved murders and disappearances. In the years since Hodgson's conviction, several other cold cases have been solved using similar combinations of DNA evidence, digital forensics, and forensic linguistics. Investigators explicitly cite the Nicholl case as inspiration and as a roadmap for how to build no-body prosecutions. Jenny's case, tragic as it is, has contributed to justice being served. In other cases, to other families receiving answers and closure. The case also serves as a reminder of the importance of victim impact and keeping the human element at the center of criminal justice. Throughout the investigation and trial, Jenny was never reduced to just a case number or a forensic puzzle. Her family's advocacy, the testimony of her friends, the description of her love of music and camping, all of this ensured that Jenny remained a three-dimensional person in the minds of investigators, prosecutors, jurors, and the public. This humanization is crucial, especially in cases where the physical absence of the victim might otherwise make them feel abstract. By constantly reminding everyone who Jenny was, what she loved, what dreams she had, the prosecution made the tragedy of her loss tangible and real. This likely contributed to the jury's willingness to convict, as they understood they were seeking justice for a real person, not just responding to an intellectual puzzle about circumstantial evidence. For true crime followers and students of criminal justice, the Jenny Nicholl case remains endlessly fascinating because it represents the intersection of so many important developments: the evolution of no-body prosecutions, the emergence of forensic linguistics, the growing sophistication of digital forensics, the impact of victim advocacy on law reform, and the persistent question of how society balances punishment with the goal of providing information and closure to victims' families. The case asks difficult questions. Should criminals who won't reveal body locations ever be released? Is forensic linguistics reliable enough to convict someone of murder? How much circumstantial evidence is enough to overcome the absence of direct proof? How do we protect young people from predatory grooming by trusted adults? These questions don't have simple answers, but Jenny's case forces us to confront them. As we reach the end of Jenny Nicholl's story, we're left with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Satisfaction that David Hodgson was held accountable, that modern forensic science, determined investigative work, delivered justice, even without the traditional evidence of a body. But sorrow, deep and lasting, that a vibrant young woman's life was stolen, that her family has never been able to lay her to rest, that somewhere in the North Yorkshire countryside, Jenny's remains lie hidden in a location only her killer knows. This case reminds us of several crucial truths about cold cases and criminal justice. First, that no case is ever truly cold as long as someone refuses to give up on it. Detective Chief Inspector Pete Martin and his team at North Yorkshire Police worked for nearly 3 years to build a case that many thought was unwinnable. They consulted with experts in emerging forensic fields. They followed every lad, no matter how small. They believed in their case and in Jenny's family, and that belief sustained them through moments of frustration and doubt. Second, the case demonstrates that forensic science is constantly evolving and that techniques once considered experimental can become powerful tools for justice. Forensic linguistics was relatively obscure in 2008. Today, it's a recognized specialty used in cases around the world. The investigators who were willing to think creatively, to bring in Dr. Tim Grant to analyze those messages, changed the course of the case, and potentially the field of criminal investigation itself. Third, Jenny's case highlights the ongoing issue of no-body murders and the unique suffering experienced by families who cannot recover their loved ones' remains. The passage of Helen's Law, which the Nicholl family helped bring about, represents progress, but it cannot undo the pain of not knowing, of being unable to have a funeral, of living in permanent limbo. These families deserve our compassion, our support, and our commitment to changing laws and policies that might ease their burden. Fourth, the case underscores the importance of recognizing and preventing grooming of young people by predatory adults. David Hodgson, began his grooming of Jenny when she was just 14. He used his status, his access to the music scene she loved, and his skills of manipulation to establish control over a vulnerable teenager. By the time the relationship became sexual and Jenny was trying to break free, years of psychological conditioning made escape incredibly difficult. We must be vigilant about protecting young people, educating them about warning signs, and creating environments where they feel safe reporting inappropriate adult attention. For Anne and Brian Nicholl, life goes on in the shadow of unbearable loss. They have found ways to channel their grief into advocacy, working to support other families in similar situations and to promote laws that provide some measure of justice when victims' bodies cannot be found. But no amount of advocacy, no legal reforms, no convictions can bring Jenny back. That is the permanent, irreversible reality they live with every single day. In Richmond, North Yorkshire, Jenny is remembered not as a cold case or legal precedent, but as a talented young woman who loved music, who played guitar in local pubs, who felt most at home under the open sky. Her friends and family keep her memory alive through annual memorial gatherings, through the scholarship created in her name, through sharing stories about her humor and kindness and the light she brought into their lives. This case, cold for nearly 3 years before it was solved, stands as a testament to the power of persistence, science, and an unwavering commitment to justice. It proves that even when traditional evidence is absent, truth can still be uncovered, and murderers can still be held accountable. The combination of DNA evidence, digital forensics, forensic linguistics, and old-fashioned detective work created a case study that continues to influence criminal investigations nearly 2 decades later. But perhaps most importantly, Jenny's case reminds us that every cold case represents more than just an unsolved crime. It represents a family still waiting for answers, a community still seeking closure, a life that deserves to be remembered and honored. Jenny Nicholl was 19 years old when her life was stolen. She should be in her late 30s now, perhaps with her own family, perhaps still playing music, certainly still bringing joy to those around her. That future was taken from her by a man who couldn't bear to lose control, who valued his own pride and possessiveness over a human life. David Hodgson sits in prison, likely for the rest of his life, refusing to this day to reveal where he hid Jenny's body. That refusal is his final act of cruelty, his last exercise of control over Jenny and her family. But he is already lost in every way that matters. He was caught, he was convicted, his freedom was taken, his reputation was destroyed. And history will remember him not as someone clever enough to evade justice, but as someone who was exposed, defeated, and imprisoned by the very evidence he thought he could manipulate. If you're listening to this story, and you have information about any unsolved case, any missing person, any cold case in your community, I encourage you to come forward. You might have the single piece of information that breaks the case wide open, that brings someone home to their family, that delivers justice long delayed. No detail is too small, no tip is worthless. You could be the person who makes the difference. Remember Jenny Nicholl. Remember all the victims of cold cases who are still waiting for justice, still waiting to be found, still waiting for someone to care enough to keep searching. They deserve our attention, our resources, and our commitment to never giving up. This cold case was solved not through luck or chance, but through determination, innovation, and a refusal to accept that murder could go unpunished. The arrest shocked the community because many thought Hodgson would never be held accountable without a body. But justice found a way, science found a way, the truth found a way, and Jenny Nicholl, though her body remains missing, was not forgotten. With that said, thank you for listening to this deep dive into a landmark cold case that changed British criminal justice. Until next time, remember, no case is ever truly cold, and justice, though sometimes delayed, never forgets.